Every time Mini releases a new car, I get a flood of emails from people asking, why is this Mini larger than the last Mini model? And this all-new Countryman is no different. For 2017, Mini completely redesigned their small crossover vehicle and made it, of course, a little bit longer, a little bit wider, etc. than the outgoing model. In the redesign process, this has become a whopping 49 inches longer than a classic Mini Cooper. Up front, we have a look that is unmistakably Mini, but we do have a few crossover clues going on here as well. For 2017, they have made this a little bit higher off the ground. We now have about 6.5 inches of ground clearance, and it's also become a little bit wider at 71.1 inches wide. In case you're still comparing this to a classic Mini, this is about 16 inches wider than that classic Mini model. Because this is Mini's latest vehicle, we have all the modern touches you would expect. LED headlamps available, we have fog lamps down below. Taking a closer look at the hood, we have a small S badge right over here, and then this honeycomb section provides cooling to the large radiators behind. Before we go on, we should talk about what the Mini brand is, what it competes with, and of course what specifically the Countryman competes with as well. Mini is generally regarded as either a premium brand or a luxury brand, depending on who you ask, and it has aspects of both. The Countryman is an excellent example of this. It starts at $26,600, which is in the same range as a Fiat 500X or perhaps a Buick Encore. But if you add all of the options that you can get on your Countryman, then you will end up right over $51,000, which is actually more expensive than a closely related BMW X1. BMW, of course, owns the Mini brand, and they co-develop the Countryman and the BMW X1 on essentially the same platform. That means they share bits under the skin, but nothing that you're actually seeing inside or outside the vehicle is directly shared with the X1. You've probably noticed all the red S's around this vehicle. We are driving the S trim of the Countryman with all-wheel drive. This is one of the most powerful modern Minis, and if you get the John Cooper Works package, you will actually get the most powerful Mini ever made. The Countryman is very solidly a compact crossover for America. This is 1 inch longer than a Buick Encore, about 2 inches longer than a Fiat 500X, but about 5 inches shorter than a BMW X1. In case you're wondering, the main difference between the BMW X1 and the Mini Countryman in terms of overall length is actually back here in the cargo area, because the wheelbase, that is the distance between the front wheels and the back wheels, is exactly the same. Although we have a squarer box on the back of this Mini than something like an Infiniti Qx30, we actually have notably less ground clearance. This comes in at 6.5 inches off the ground. That is a little low for the luxury subcompact crossover segment. Moving to the rear, we find a more modern interpretation of the Mini tail lamps that we've seen for some time. They have concentric rings inside this tail lamp module. Below the tail lamps, we find reflectors, dual exhaust tips, and of course well-integrated parking sensors. As you'd expect out of a luxury small crossover, a power tailgate is actually available in this Mini version, although our model does not get it. In the United States, the Countryman is offered with 4 different drivetrains. Things start out with a 1.5-liter 3-cylinder turbocharged engine that produces 134 horsepower and 162 pound-feet of torque. That's basically the same engine that we find in a variety of different Mini models, and interestingly enough, it's closely related to what we see in the BMW i8 as well. Then we get a 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine like this one right here in 2 different power levels, either 189 horsepower that we're driving or 228 if you opt for the John Cooper Works package. That 228 horsepower trim is basically the same one that we find under the hood of the BMW X1. If you want to put a little green under the hood of your Mini, you can get a plug-in hybrid system that uses a 1.5-liter turbocharged 3-cylinder engine and a motor driving the back axles. That will give you a range of about 12 miles, but interestingly enough, it won't actually give you the best combined fuel economy. That hybrid model comes in at 27 miles per gallon, and if you get the 1.5-liter turbocharged engine by itself, you could get up to 28. Depending on the engine that you select, you'll find either a 6-speed manual transmission, a 6-speed automatic, or an 8-speed automatic under the hood. I'm going to give front seat comfort 8 out of 10 points, primarily because we have the manual seats in this model. Power seats are available. We still have an extending thigh cushion that you can see right over here on the passenger side as well, and we have an adjustable lumbar support. And that means that even though these are manual seats, they are going to be more comfortable than the average manual seat in the mainstream or even the premium segment. Personally, I found these seats to be a little bit more comfortable than the last Buick Encore we drove, but a little bit less comfortable than the last X1 or Q3. We have a tilt telescopic steering column with a large range of motion, and in kind of an interesting move, the instrument cluster moves with the steering wheel. Moving to the back seats, we find a very generous amount of legroom. This compares very well with the luxury subcompact crossovers. At 6 feet tall, you'll notice I still have about 2 inches of legroom left. It's worth noting that we find less headroom back here than some of the luxury competition. However, headroom is still actually quite generous. We are in the model with the dual pane sunroof, and my hair is just barely brushing the ceiling. My head is not touching the ceiling. I have about an inch left. We also have a reclining seat back in the rear. There's a little piece of webbing over here. This is the most upright position, and we can recline it about 3 inches to make it a little bit more comfortable. Now, this is still a subcompact crossover, so if I scoot over to the middle seat, we definitely find a little bit less room across this rear bench than you'll find in something like a BMW X3 or a Mercedes-Benz GLC. But this is still the kind of vehicle that you could put 3 adults in the back of and go to lunch if you needed to, because again, headroom is very generous. We actually get a little bit more headroom in this center seating position than we got in the outboard seats. And if I move all the way over to the right side of the vehicle, where I had a 6'5" passenger, I definitely have enough room to sit back here behind that seat. Behind the rear hatch, we find just under 18 cubic feet of storage space, which is pretty average for a luxury subcompact crossover, but it is a little bit behind the BMW X1. The cargo area offers 2 tiers of storage, but you'll notice that we don't have quite enough room there to store a 22-inch roller bag under that cargo area load floor. However, there's still plenty of room to put the bags even in this position and still easily close the hatch. The size of this cargo area means that it would be pretty easy to put 4 of these 22-inch roller bags back here. The rear seat backs fold in a 40-20-40 fashion, and the 20 section in the middle actually folds independently of the outboard seat positions. That makes it an awful lot handier to put large items inside this cargo area. As we take a look around this interior, keep in mind that we are in an S-level trim with a decent number of options. We have this large panoramic dual-pane moonroof. We do have these translucent covers right here, which is not my preference. I prefer something that blocks just a little bit more light. The driver and front passenger get fixed height seat belts and 2-way adjustable headrests. The model that we're driving has this very attractive fabric upholstery with leather trim right there on the side of the seats. Even though our model does not have power seats, we still have adjustable lumbar. That's what this knob right here on the side of the seat is for. We also have this manually extending thigh cushion on the seat bottom to help improve comfort for taller drivers or taller front passengers. As you'd expect out of a vehicle that could reach $51,000, we find a large number of soft touch plastics and of course fabric that matches the seat on the front door panels. Lower on the door panels, we do find hard plastics right there around that storage cubby and bottle holder, and you'll notice we have a red line running there right through the middle. That is the ambient lighting inside the vehicle. The color of the ambient light strip can be adjusted via a toggle just above the rearview mirror. The overall design of the dashboard is definitely modern Mini. We have a soft touch injection molded upper section of the dashboard, and then this trim strip that runs right across the dash. As we see in other Mini models, there's quite a bit of customization available, so you don't have to get this gray trim if you don't want to. On the passenger side, we have a slot-style glove compartment, easily able to accommodate a large tablet computer. In the center of the dashboard, we find Mini's latest infotainment and navigation system. This is based off of BMW's iDrive and receives some of the latest updates from that iDrive system. One of the most noticeable changes is that this is now a touchscreen system, so you can either use the controller knob in the center, or you can actually use the touchscreen to interact with the system. We don't see Apple CarPlay or Android Auto available yet, but BMW has told us to expect it in this Mini very soon. Outside the infotainment screen, we have this LED ring. This can be adjusted to perform several different functions. Right now, it is mimicking the tachometer, so as I rev the vehicle, you notice it'll climb right over there. It also indicates the drive mode that you're in, so if we choose the green mode, it flashes green momentarily. If we go back to mid, it'll flash amber, and then of course, sport will flash red. Below the screen, we have a few direct access buttons. We have track forward, backward, a power button, and volume knob, and then we have some preset buttons that are touch sensitive right below. So very much like we see in BMW models, as we run our finger on them without actually pushing them, it'll show you what that button is actually going to do. So that'll take us right over to the chill Sirius XM station. As far as infotainment and navigation systems go in this segment, this is definitely more fully featured than anything that we find in the Buick Encore or something like the Fiat 500X. This is also better in my opinion than what we see in the Audi Q3 or in the Mercedes-Benz GLA. The Q3 and the GLA don't receive the latest versions of their brand's infotainment and navigation systems, but this basically does. Below the infotainment system, we find the controls for the dual-zone automatic climate control system. We find temperature knobs on each side, and then of course controls to adjust the seat heating below that. Continuing down, we have a few toggles for the parking sensors. There's a little light right there in the end of this toggle so you can see that it's on or off. We have a button to enable and disable the start-stop system, traction control, and then of course a button to enable and disable the heads-up display. Right in the middle of everything, we have this red start-stop toggle for the engine. Continuing down from there, we have one of 2 USB inputs, the auxiliary input, a 12-volt power port, and then a small storage cubby without a lid in front of the cup holders. The cup holders are large and well located. I had no problem fitting large American takeout drinks in them, and they don't knock on the controls when they're in those cup holders. In order to help protect the controls just a little bit more, they also have little rings right here between each of the controls that stick out, so that way you can't accidentally toggle them. The shifter is a pretty classic console shifter. All the way back is drive. We toggle over to the left for the manual or sport mode. Right now we're in the sport mode. We engage manual by either toggling up or down or using the optional paddles on the back of the steering wheel. Behind that we find an electric parking brake control and then the controller for the infotainment system. This is very similar to what we see in BMW's latest iDrive. This features finger writing recognition, and this toggle scrolls around, clicks down to enter, toggles up, down, side to side, and then we have some direct access buttons for media, communications, map, nav, a menu button, back button, and of course vehicle options. Between the front seats, we find a softly padded center armrest. This opens to reveal a cell phone holder. This is optional. I probably wouldn't get it because larger smartphones don't fit inside this little area. The center armrest ratchets into place for taller drivers, and it lifts up and out of the way to reveal another storage area right down here where we find a second USB port and definitely enough room for wallets, keys, that sort of thing. On the driver's side, we find a very familiar instrument cluster. We have a tachometer over here on the left and a large central speedometer. The LED array on the right side of your screen is the fuel gauge, and then we have a small color multifunction display right there inside the speedometer. The display's readouts are limited primarily to trip computer information because most of the other vehicle information is found in the infotainment system in the center console. Above the steering wheel, we have an optional pop-up heads-up display. This is very similar to what we've seen in some Mazda models. This is a full color heads-up display, and in addition to that speedometer, as you can see right here, we can also change the channel on our Sirius XM interface. You can also change the track if you're playing from an iPod or other USB media device. And of course, we get turn-by-turn navigation directions on this screen as well. And lastly, you would get radar cruise control information and certain vehicle safety readouts in this display. From this angle, you should be able to see that pop-up heads-up display. It is right above the main instrument cluster. The steering wheel is a 3-spoke design. We have aggressive sport grips up top, paddle shifters behind, and a little John Cooper Works badge right there at the bottom. On the left side of the steering wheel, we find the controls for the cruise control system. On the right side, we find the controls for the infotainment system. Track up, down, OK. Volume up, down. Again, this button works in conjunction with that heads-up display. We have a voice command button and then a phone button as well. In our tests, this S trim ran from 0 to 60 in 7.2 seconds. If you get the John Cooper Works version of the Countryman, then that should drop down to right around 6.2, 6.3 seconds. 7.2 seconds puts this in about the same range as the more powerful engine option in the Buick Encore, very similar to the Audi Q3 as well. But this is going to be slower 0 to 60 than the Infiniti Qx30 or the Bmw X1. Mini's reputation has been built on creating vehicles that are fun to drive, but fun to drive in Mini terms does not necessarily mean fast 0 to 60 acceleration, because 7.2 seconds 0 to 60 is in the realm of the average midsize family sedan. Keeping in mind that the Countryman is of course a small crossover, stopping distances are a little bit longer than the other Mini models. This stopped from 60 miles an hour back to 0 in 128 feet. That was on a dry surface. I know it looks a little wet out there right now, but our testing 0 to 60 and 60 to 0 were both done on dry surfaces. 128 feet is a little bit long for the luxury small crossover segment, but actually on the short side for the mainstream subcompact crossover segment. In addition to becoming bigger over the years, Minis have also become heavier over the years. And this is now substantially similar in terms of curb weight to the BMW X1 or the Audi Q3 or the Mercedes-Benz GLA. And that's why it's not going to accelerate, brake, or handle like some of the other Minis available in America. Although when it comes to handling, I'm still going to give this an A-, even in this S trim. Obviously, if you get the JCW version, then it is going to handle a little bit better. But as it is, this actually outhandles the related BMW X1 and the Mercedes-Benz GLA 250. Handling is also notably above the Fiat 500X or the Buick Encore. That shouldn't surprise you too much because in most ways the Countryman really does sit somewhere between the Buick Encore and the average luxury entry in most ways. Out on rougher gravel roads like this, you'll notice that the Mini Countryman has a firm ride, and that's something that we've come to expect from the Mini brand. But this is actually not as firm as some of the other entries in this luxury subcompact crossover segment. I personally found this ride to be more livable than something like the GLA. Therefore, when it comes to our overall ride score, I'm going to give this a B+. This is going to be a little bit less comfortable than your average compact luxury crossover, something like an X3 or Mercedes-Benz GLC, but this is still going to be a little bit more comfortable than some of those very firm, sporty entries in this segment. If you were to get the John Cooper Works version of the Countryman, then obviously that score is going to drop down a bit. Back out here on a paved road, it would be no problem to drive the Countryman on a long car trip. This is definitely the most livable suspension that we find in the Mini family. In our cabin noise test at 50 miles an hour, this scored 72 decibels, meaning that this was a little bit louder than some of the luxury competition. According to the EPA, this model should be averaging right around 25 miles per gallon. We have been getting 24.5 miles per gallon. Obviously, that is lower than a number of mainstream crossovers, so something like a Honda HR-V is going to get considerably better fuel economy than this, but this does not compete with the Honda. Instead, this competes with the Bmw X1, the Qx30, the GLA, etc., and in that comparative set, this actually does fairly well, because most of those vehicles are going to be right around 25 miles per gallon for the same sort of power we find under this hood. I'd be lying, of course, if I said that the Mini Countryman was just as fun to drive as other Mini models, or just as fun to drive as that original Mini when BMW resurrected the brand. The Countryman is just a little bit too high off the ground, a little bit too heavy, a little bit too softly sprung in order to say that about this vehicle. However, this is an awful lot of fun when you compare it to the rest of the luxury crossover competition. This actually outhandles the Mercedes-Benz GLA 250. As I said before, Mini definitely sells heavily on style, but that doesn't mean that they've forgotten the fun-to-drive quotient that has made Mini, Mini. As I said at the beginning of the video, the Countryman sort of sits between a premium subcompact crossover like the Buick Encore and a luxury subcompact crossover like the Mercedes-Benz GLA or BMW's own X1. And that's obvious when we take a look at the price tag. For 2018, the Countryman starts at $26,600. The important thing to keep in mind is that that base price gets you a 3-cylinder turbocharged engine and a manual transmission. If you want to add all-wheel drive, you have to add $2,000 to the price tag, and if you want an automatic transmission, that is extra as well. That means that even though the $26,000 price tag looks a little close to certain mainstream subcompact crossovers like a top-end trim of a Mazda CX-3, comparably equipped, the Mini is going to be notably more expensive than a Mazda. That's pretty obvious when you start climbing the ladder, because the Cooper S trim of the Countryman that we were driving started at $31,200, and again, if you get carried away with options, you can get your Countryman over $50,000. Because Mini offers so many options on every vehicle they sell, we're really not going to spend too much time on this page. You should just know that you can get really carried away with options if you want to. There are a lot of things that you can select and customize on your Mini, but you're definitely going to have to pay for that level of customization. Now let's talk about the key takeaways for the Countryman. The first thing you should know is that most models start with a manual transmission. That is a little bit rare even in the luxury segment, but it really seems to speak to the core of the Mini brand. Another key takeaway is that that base 3-cylinder engine is fairly slow. 0 to 60 acceleration in that model is going to be as slow or perhaps even slower than something like a Honda HR-V. It's actually quite close to a Toyota Prius. If you want one of the better 0 to 60 acceleration times in this segment, you can get it with the John Cooper Works version, but that will get you about the same kind of power that we see in the current generation BMW X1. Even though the Mini starts with the manual transmission and there are tons of options to choose from, it doesn't really feel like a stripped out vehicle even in the base models. That's because Mini includes a lot of standard features that we see optional in other competitors, like the keyless entry and keyless go system, the large panoramic moonroof that we saw on the model we were driving, and rear parking sensors that make parking the vehicle a little bit easier. With that, let's move on to comparisons. Because of the base price of the Countryman, you could see it as a competitor to certain trims of the Buick Encore, or perhaps the Fiat 500X, although I think the Fiat 500X is a little bit more of a stretch. The Buick Encore, on the other hand, is definitely trying to be a step above the mainstream entries, and that's why we see the Chevy Trax being the competitor to something like a Honda HR-V, and the Encore being the competitor to the Countryman. The standard 4-cylinder turbocharged engine in the Encore will get you from 0 to 60 faster than the base model of the Countryman, and the optional 4-cylinder turbo in the Encore will get you from 0 to 60 about as fast as the S trim of the Countryman that we were driving. Pricing, optional features, and luxury touches are what separate the Encore from the Mini Countryman. The Encore is very well equipped in base models, and if you're comparing comparably priced vehicles, you're going to find an awful lot more content in the Buick than you will in the Mini. But the Buick is not going to feel quite as unique, quite as special as the Mini Countryman. The Countryman's interior is put together with a greater level of precision. It also is definitely more stylized than we find in the Buick. However, the Buick is going to be notably less expensive. In fact, a 3-cylinder Countryman could be about $4,000 more than a comparably equipped Buick Encore. And if you take a look at the S-Trim that we were driving this week and a comparable Buick Encore that has relatively similar 0 to 60 performance figures, you could pay $6,000 to $7,000 more for the Mini than for the Buick. Next up, we have the Countryman's close cousin, the BMW X1. The Countryman and the X1 are tough competitors, not just because they're related, but because the two vehicles are very compelling in this segment. The X1 is practical, it's also quite comfortable, having a very accommodating back seat, and it offers a decent amount of standard power. That standard power is one of the big differences between the X1 and the Countryman, because the Countryman uses that 3-cylinder turbocharged engine or a detuned version of the 2-liter 4-cylinder engine in the S-Trim that we were driving, whereas all BMW X1s get the same engine that we find in the MINI Countryman John Cooper works. And that means that if you want to go 0 to 60 as fast in your Countryman as in a base BMW X1, you may actually pay more for your Countryman than for the X1. Aside from that, the difference ends up being largely stylistic. The Countryman is much more stylized, the X1 is much more sedate, much more traditional luxury car. The Mini handles a little bit better, the BMW is a little bit better off-road, and it offers a little bit more standard power, but again, you can get the same engine and same transmission under the hood of the Mini if you want to. Passenger room is quite similar between the two models, but the X1 does have a notably larger cargo area. Next up, we have the Audi Q3. The Q3 is getting a little bit old, even though it seems like it just came to America. The reason for that is that it launched in other world markets before we got it here in the United States. It is not the close relative of the Audi A3, interestingly enough. It actually is the closer relative to the previous generation A3. As a result, although the Q3 handles absolutely excellently, and it is actually probably the best handling vehicle in this segment outside of an AMG version of the GLA, the Q3 just doesn't feel quite as fresh as the A3 or quite as engaging as an A3 either. It also has one of Audi's older design 4-cylinder engines, and that results in a very slow 0 to 60 time for that model. It is actually one of the slowest entries in this segment, 0 to 60, although it is the best handling. If you're looking at the Q3, my personal advice would be wait till the next generation model happens. Our last competitor is the Infiniti Qx30, a very interesting entry in this segment because some people are a little bit confused as to whether the Qx30 is a crossover or just a hatchback. Now the Qx30 does look kind of like a hatchback, but it actually has more ground clearance, considerably more ground clearance, than the MINI Countryman that we were driving that does look more like a crossover because it's a little bit boxier in the back. The question is, of course, made a little bit tougher because there are a few different versions of the Qx30. There's a lower to the ground model that is front-wheel drive only, and then of course we have the higher off-the-ground all-wheel drive models. Because the modern crossover really is just a lifted hatchback, I'm willing to give Infiniti a pass on this because it does have the ground clearance, all-wheel drive, and overall seating position of a crossover. The Qx30 also has one of the lower starting prices in this segment, starting at $29,950. That low starting price and the fact that it comes with a standard automatic transmission puts it definitely in direct competition with even the base models of the Countryman, and we get more power in the Qx30 than we find in the Mini, 208 horsepower out of its 2-liter 4-cylinder turbocharged engine. It's also going to be notably smoother in terms of overall engine dynamics than that 3-cylinder in the Mini. Another thing worth noting is that even though it produces less power than the John Cooper Works version of the MINI Countryman, it actually is just as fast 0 to 60. And that means that for $29,950, you will go 0 to 60 faster than every other model of the Countryman. All of this is possible because the Qx30 is sort of the crazy love child between Nissan and Daimler-Benz. And that's pretty obvious when you sit inside the Qx30 because you start reaching for things and you think, oh, that's a Mercedes part over there, and then you reach for something else and you say, oh, well, that's Infiniti over there. Basically what they did is they took Infiniti parts and they took some Daimler-Benz parts, they jammed them in a mixer and poured it on top of a chassis that was designed by Mercedes. On the surface of things, it seems like that would make the Qx30 a Frankenstein's monster of a crossover, but it works incredibly well, strangely enough. Infiniti was able to fix everything that I dislike about the transmission in the Mercedes-Benz CLA and the Mercedes-Benz GLA, while they retained all the handling ability that we find in those two Mercedes models. They were also able to give it a slightly more intuitive infotainment system than Mercedes Command, and they wrapped it in some very unique sheet metal that really doesn't look like the Mercedes at all. In fact, I actually kind of like the way the QX30 looks. It's very distinctive in this segment, and that's not something that we can say for the Q3 or the BMW X1. But the Infiniti is also a pretty good buy, because it starts just under $30,000 and tops out right at $45,000. That's $5,000 to $6,000 less than the German options in this segment. And that's why my top pick in this subcompact luxury crossover segment has to be the 2018 Infiniti Qx30. Again, this is a blend of all that I like about Infiniti and all I like about Mercedes, interestingly shoved into one car. But I also have to say that the BMW X1 is an excellent buy, and it is my tie in this segment. That's because the X1 is a very well-rounded vehicle. It's comfortable, it has an enormous cargo area, it has a big back seat, much bigger than what we find in the QX30, and the X1 is chock full of all the luxury gadgets and gizmos that you'd expect in a modern BMW, just sort of jammed into a smaller front-wheel drive biased package. It is close, but I'm going to have to put the Countryman below the BMW X1. The main reason for that is the base engine. I think that if the Countryman was about the same price, but had the 4-cylinder engine, not the 3-cylinder engine in the base model, then I would take it over the BMW X1. I like the styling of the Countryman a little bit better than the BMW, actually. It's a little bit more unique, it's a little bit more stylish, I think, but it's just a little bit too slow in the base trim, especially when we take a look at options like the GLA 250 or the Infiniti Qx30, which are notably faster in their base engines, and of course the closely related BMW X1, which in its base form is as powerful as the top-end version of the Mini. Thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Be sure and let me know what you think about the Countryman down there in the comment section below. Find us over at facebook.com/AlexandAutos. Also head over to patreon.com if you want to support this channel, and I hope you do, and I'll see you next week.